Welcome to The Horse Race. I'm Daniel Vaughn, your host for the night and senior columnist at the Conservative Institute. You can find my columns, you can find news analysis, you can find political analysis, all the best that's out there. Go back onto the Conservative Institute. I also have a personal column called The Beltway Outsiders. You can sign up for that newsletter as well. And we're bringing you all the latest and greatest in the polls as we're leading up to the 2024 November election. So on tonight's show, we're going to cover the pre-debate stuff. I'm recording on Wednesday, and on Thursday, we're going to have the CNN debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It's the first one of the year. It's the first time we've ever had a debate like this before the conventions. I mean, technically, the primaries are not even over. We do not actually have an official coronation event for both men, but we are proceeding as if we do for both of them. So we're going to have a debate here and for the first time in the summer. Normally this stuff doesn't kick off until well after Labor Day, but here we are in the middle of June having our first presidential debate. So we're going to get into the polling that has dropped the day before. You're going to, in a lot of the coverage you hear, well, this is a very toss-up race. This is a close race. And what is becoming clearer and clearer, the more you look at the models, the more that you look at the polls, this is not a toss-up race. So on the eve of the first debate of this race, Joe Biden is getting some absolutely horrible polls, and he's getting them from some A-plus pollsters, people that you can't dismiss out of hand. One of them is Quinnipiac. It's a left-leaning pollster, at least they have been in previous elections. They now have Donald Trump in the lead. The other is the New York Times Siena. They also have Donald Trump in the lead. So right before the debates are dropping, we're getting some polls that are showing Trump with a fairly commanding lead in this race. And it's beginning to look like the conviction story is fading pretty hard as we're heading into this first debate. And the race is settling back into an equilibrium where Donald Trump is very clearly leading, and that lead and that momentum is growing again. So that's where we're going to start off. We're going to start with the polling averages from Real Clear Politics. They give you the best, the absolute best, because they give you everything. So this is where we stand before the CNN debate. You have Donald Trump with a 1.5 point lead in the Real Clear Politics average. This is up. His lead was around a half a point, sometimes drifting as low as 0.2 or 0.3 in the polling average here, but he's now up to a 1.5. Now you might say, well, that's pretty close. Why isn't that a toss-up? I want you to look at a very important line here. This day in history. June 26, 2020, Joe Biden was leading the polls by 9.5 points. And now you have Donald Trump leading by 1.5 points. That's an 11-point swing from 2020 to now. And that 4 years, 4 years from now, you're looking at an 11-point swing. That is a seismic shift. That is something that you don't typically see in politics, but it is something that you would expect to see if the incumbent president is polling poorly, has low approval ratings, and is struggling across the board, which Joe Biden is doing if you look at any of these polls. One of the things that is propping up this average here is the Rasmussen reports here, which has Trump as a +9. I would largely discard this poll because it's just an outlier. It's not going to be an accurate representation of what we're seeing, particularly when you're looking at some of these others. But if you're Joe Biden, the two polls that are going to trouble you the most here, it's not the Rasmussen. They would discount that anyway. It's the latest two that have gone in. New York Times Siena poll here and Quinnipiac, both of which have Trump with a 4-point lead. And that is very large, particularly if you factor in, 9.5 from where we were then to 4 points now. That is a very large point gap for Biden to make up. And the thing about the New York Times Siena poll dropping right before the CNN debates, this is the type of poll that pretty much eradicates any talk points that you might have to say, oh, well, this is a toss-up race. This is a close race. Now, are there aspects of this race that are going to be close? Absolutely. But when you dig into numbers like this, what you're seeing is that the swing states are moving in one direction, and it's towards Donald Trump. And when the national polls are showing this, if we had legitimately, if you had Donald Trump winning the national popular vote by 4 points in November, there would be a meltdown on the, in the mainstream media and on the Democratic left, because they would not understand how this would even be possible. But this is where we are. This is truly where we are. I wanted to dig into these two specifically real quick to kind of give you a breakdown of what's happening here. The first is the Quinnipiac numbers. If you look here, they're telling you, right as we're heading into this, that the majority of voters are planning to watch this one, but you are seeing that Donald Trump has a 4-point lead, 49 to 45. And this lead is pretty consistent all the way through. You'll note here, they call this a small change from their May poll, in which it was too close to call. That was just a Biden +1. I would call that a disingenuous description of these two polls. Going from Biden +1 to Trump +4 is a 5-point swing, and a very significant one. And we're going to dig into this here. It says I looked at Quinnipiac's numbers. I pulled all of them from January to the present, factoring in this poll, because in general, I don't consider Quinnipiac a very reputable pollster. They had a lot of bad polls over the last few election cycles. But the trend line here, I think, is interesting for them, because they're mostly considered, it's one of the more Biden-friendly polls. That would be the best way to put it. So if you go back, like I did, and you pull the two-way numbers for this year, in January, Biden had a 6-point lead in this poll. In February, that shrunk to 4 points. By March to 3. In April, it was a tie race for them. In May, they gave him another 1-point lead, but now we're talking Trump +4. So from the first of the year until now, you're looking at a 10-point swing in the Quinnipiac numbers. They've gone from Biden heavy, and remember here, in January, this Biden +6 number, this would have been one of his best polls then, because at this point, this was when Donald Trump was convincingly leading the point. Remember, Donald Trump took over the lead in the averages on September 11th, 2023, and really hasn't looked back since. And during the winter, he was sitting at around 2 to 3 points lead in the averages, kind of where he is now. And so Quinnipiac at the time was still saying, well, we still think Biden's leading by 6 points. That's gone now. And maybe this is an outlier, but even if it is an outlier and they drift back down, you're still looking at them going from Biden +6 to a Trump lead. And even if you're saying, well, it's just a tie, they're still saying that Biden has lost 6 points since the winter. So this is, Quinnipiac is, they may call this a small change, but it's still a very large shift from where we were over the last 6 months. So when you start including the hypothetical 6-way race, so this is when you start bringing in Robert F. Kennedy, Cornel West, Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, Trump has an even larger lead. You've got a 6-point lead here with Quinnipiac. And that's what a lot of these ballots are going to look like come November. You're going to have all these candidates on there. It's not going to be the clean two-way race. But the reason we focus on that two-way race was because it kind of really tells you, who are the core supporters for each of them? Where are they breaking? You can give a person this kind of ballot, but if you only give them the two, where are they breaking? Or are they just not voting? And it is interesting here that in either case, you have Donald Trump with a convincing lead in both of these numbers. Now, going back to the Real Clear Politics average, you'll note we're going to hit the New York Times Siena poll here. They're showing the same things. Now, the New York Times, I consider it an A+ pollster. They're one of the best in the game. Their state-by-state polls that come out are some of the best that you're going to find. And even they have the same numbers at Quinnipiac. So this is a significant number for them as well. So go over here to their piece, and this is their first poll, including the conviction period for Donald Trump. They didn't have one in the immediate aftermath. They typically wait and do one around their set times. Pretty common for them, and they are finding that Republicans are rallying behind Donald Trump after the conviction. The key paragraph here that you should take away is that in the first poll here, the former president's trial ended with a guilty verdict, and more than 2/3 of voters said the outcome of his Manhattan criminal case made no difference on their vote. 2/3. So that's part of why you're seeing Trump's numbers buoyed here, because the Bragg case is not having much of a dent in things. And now we're moving out of June and into July, and we're getting further away from that conviction storyline. And so you're seeing this fade even more because you're seeing the race equalize where things are returning to an equilibrium. And before the conviction, that equilibrium was Donald Trump was leading in the polls, and we're returning to that point here. And you still have, it's not hurting him with Republicans. Still 90% of Republicans view him favorably. So you're looking at a very seismic shift here for the New York Times. I've got a link in the show notes. You can go if you want to read through this whole story. It is a very large margin, and it is something that they're seeing across the board. The interesting thing about these numbers here, and this is the chart I wanted to find here, was they did a split where they were looking at likely voters versus registered voters. When you get closer and closer to an election, you shift out of what are called registered voter polls and into likely voter polls, because instead of with a registered voter, these are people who are registered to vote and you're thinking are likely to vote. A likely voter is not necessarily registered, but they're saying that they're going to vote. So this is where you're trying to, as a pollster, to guesstimate what the electorate is going to look like. And in both cases, you have Donald Trump leading both of them. In the registered voter poll with New York Times, it's 6 points. With the likely voter polls, Biden's performance increases, and it's close to, Trump's support drops to 3 points. But in either event here, you still have the same result. Donald Trump is leading in both. There's been some chatter in the election commentary space that all these polls right now that are bad for Biden are biased, and they're biased because most of them have been registered voter polls. And this is pretty typical this far out. You would expect most pollsters to be using registered voters, and then they would shift late as they're trying to figure out what the likely voter pool is. And so what Biden supporters have been saying is that these registered voter polls don't represent the true electorate, and the likely voter polls, which have in general been a little bit friendlier to Joe Biden, they would show a better sign for Joe Biden as we get closer to November. But what this is showing is that while you do see an improvement here, you still see the same story. In the averages and everywhere else, Donald Trump is leading. And in the past, when these likely voter polls got closer to November, what we've actually found in 2016 and 2020, Donald Trump typically overperformed that likely voter pool. So I would not want to put all my eggs in this basket like the Biden supporters are, but this is where they are, and this is where the race is. We have, you remember, this is Biden led by 9.5 points in 2020. Clinton was leading by 6.7 points by now, and we've got a Trump 1.5 margin here where he's leading. And this matters. I'm going to get into a little bit here as we shift into Nate Silver's model assumptions here, but this matters because what it shows you is that the electorate is pivoting towards Trump from where it was in 2016. This is a more friendly environment right now, more friendly polling environment for Donald Trump than when he won in 2016. This is right now, you've got Joe Biden performing worse than Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden has to hit certain markers in polling for us to know that he's going to make it, basically, that he's got to hit certain markers in the national polling to put together his coalition. We're going to get into that specifically because there's some ways you can kind of look at this and add a few percentage points this way and the other to kind of figure out where the election is trending. But the lump sum of it is that this is not a toss-up race. This is a Trump leading race. This is Donald Trump clearly in a commanding lead. If you look here at the chart, Donald Trump still leads in the overall average, and he has not relinquished the lead that he has had since September of 2023. At no point, even with a conviction, even with some of the State of the Union polls that gave Biden a friendly bounce, Donald Trump is still leading. He has not at any point since September relinquished that lead. And you can find it over here. Last summer in 2023, you had a Biden lead, and then it rapidly faded and turned into a Trump lead, which he has not given up. So this is the race that we're in right now. We're in Trump is in the lead. He's in a fairly commanding lead for what we've seen in some of his previous races, and that kind of thing matters. And you're seeing some of this shift, some of the polling prognosticators. Sean Trende over at Real Clear Politics put out a piece talking about how he has perhaps been too bearish on Donald Trump's chances. And Nate Silver put out his election forecast, and it gave Donald Trump the lead in it as well. So that's a good segue here to shift into Nate Silver's his Silver Bulletin, his election model. So I've kind of touched on this in the past on some of the previous shows. Nate Silver kept all the intellectual property of his polling averages and his election models at 538. So when I covered 538's model, I said at the time that it was a new model. And so it was hard to judge what the accuracy of this 538 model, because I know that all the guts of it has been turned inside out, and Nate Silver took all of his stuff. Nate took it and has put it on his Substack here, the Silver Bulletin. And he gets into the methodology and everything that's going through here. And one of the things that he mentions here that I think is important is that he sees this race as an inverse of the 2012 race. So in 2012, the national polls were pretty tight. You had Romney and Obama polling pretty closely on the top level polls. But if you looked at the state level polls, Obama had a clear margin across the board in all of the key states. All the metrics trended towards Obama in very important swing states. And Obama ended up winning the national popular vote by around 4.5 points. In 2020, you saw Joe Biden basically put together that exact 2012 blueprint and exact same voting block. He won by around 4.7 points in the national popular vote, brought together the same type of states, made some inroads in places like Georgia, and that is what delivered him the Electoral College. But it basically was a version of that Obama 2012, because in 2008, you had the economic recession, and Obama just wiped the board with Republicans across the board. That retreated quite a bit in 2012, but Obama was still able to make enough inroads across key swing states to blunt Mitt Romney's, bringing things much closer than they were. So now in 2024, we're looking at sort of an inverse of that. And that's important because of the margins involved here. So you remember us saying that Donald Trump is leading, and where I think that Joe Biden needs to be is leading these polls by around 4.5 points, or at least he needs to take an actual national popular vote lead once November comes of around that margin, around 4.5 points, to guarantee that he can retake his all the states that he took in 2020. It just doesn't look like that's happening. And one of the things that Nate gets through, it's a long piece. He puts up his version of who's ahead in the polls. You see sort of the same thing with the Donald Trump lead. They're all kind of showing the same thing. His state and polling averages are showing a similar thing, where you have Trump leading in most of these key states. You have the national margins up here versus the key swing states where Trump is leading. He has Kennedy here as an important third party. The thing that he points out here, and that I think is important. So I guess I should start back. His model is giving Joe Biden, or giving Donald Trump, a 66% chance to win right now. So right at the gate, his model, which is the model from 538 from previous cycles, says that Donald Trump has a 66% chance of winning. Right now, with all the data that it's bringing in, that's all his fundamentals. So things like incumbency advantage, the economy, and other things like that. All this is baked in. And right now, more likely than not, you would say that Donald Trump's going to win this race. Does that mean it's shut and closed? Of course not. And 66% odds are high, but still, that is enough for a Joe Biden victory. And if you go back to 2016, Hillary Clinton had above 50% chance of winning in that model. But there are very clearly still paths where Donald Trump can win. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. Yes, there are paths to a Biden victory, but those are much narrower than what we're looking at with Donald Trump. And the key thing here is, if you look across the state averages, Biden right now is almost clearly losing Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And the Nevada polling in particular, I have kind of ignored for a while because it is a notoriously difficult state to poll, but it is trending so hard towards Donald Trump that you can't ignore the polls. And the experts out in that area are kind of saying the same thing. They don't know what the margin is of Trump's lead, but the trend lines are clear. Donald Trump is leading there. And if he does that, that takes away one of those key states for Biden in what's called the Sun Belt. So that's the South, that's out the Southwest. And basically, Biden is losing enough inroads among Hispanic voters and blue collar voters to these areas where he's taking over these places from Democrats. And so it's a very significant thing for Biden because if he loses that, that narrows his path considerably. And what Nate brings up here is he loses these three states in particular. The only thing that Biden can do at that point is he must win the Midwest states, and that is Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And he can't drop one of them. And in this scenario, if this is the path that Biden ends up taking, this is how close it would end up being. It would be he would need to win by 270 electoral college votes on the nose. It would be 270 to 268. That's increasingly the path that Democrats see as their only way to victory because we're starting to see Democrats not even remotely contest Georgia now. Arizona is going to be contested because there is Kari Lake is out there in the Senate race, and she is down despite Donald Trump dominating that race out there. The Senate is going to get a lot of focus there, so that will bring Democrats out there. If Kari Lake were just frankly a better candidate, you would see this follow similar suit where I think you would see Democrats pull out because they don't think they would have a chance. And then there's Nevada, which is contested every election. But you're going to see, I think, national money pull out of here and really hone in on Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And if you watch where Biden's events are, he is in particular hitting Michigan very, very hard. And that suggests to me, and it should suggest to you, that they do not believe that they're safe in Michigan, which is a state that I would not necessarily think would be easy for Trump to win. But it is one that the Biden campaign is very worried about. Part of the reason is that there's a high Palestinian and Muslim population in Michigan, which is hurting Biden considerably because they are looking at maybe a third party vote. It's not that Trump is necessarily going to win them. They're going to leave Biden and go for Trump, but it's more likely that they might vote for a Kennedy. They might vote for a Jill Stein or Cornel West. They're going to vote for those people instead of a Joe Biden. And the White House is very worried about that situation. So that's why you're seeing Biden go back and go back and go back. I would not necessarily call that the safest route here, particularly with Jamal Bowman losing in New York and losing in a primary over the Israel issue right now in the war in Gaza. It would make a little bit more smarter sense, I would think, to just stick with the pro-Israel line and follow sort of John Fetterman's path. I think he's navigated this pretty well for a Democrat in a swing state, and notably he is in Pennsylvania. And where Pennsylvania goes, it is my belief you're going to see Michigan, Wisconsin, and perhaps Minnesota go. I'm not really expecting Trump to be competitive in Minnesota. It may be closer than normal, but Minnesota is a notoriously difficult state for Republicans to win in. Famously, in Ronald Reagan's 49-state landslide, it was Minnesota that did not go for him, and I just would not expect it to happen here. And that's why Nate Silver's focusing on Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, because if Trump sweeps Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada and just takes one of these others, and I would wager that Pennsylvania is the most important of these, the race is over. The race is absolutely over, and Donald Trump's going to win. In fact, he's going to win, and it's going to be an early night. It's going to be a little bit like 2016, where we're going to know who the winner of that race is. We're going to know it pretty early on in the night, and we're going to be able to make projections from some of these early states into some of the later states and know exactly what's going to happen later in the night. So these are some of Nate Silver's assumptions here. I think he's pretty spot on in a lot of his analysis. He is suggesting that the Rosie case for Joe Biden is not that great. And when you have an election modeler like Nate Silver saying this type of thing, it should raise some red flags for you, because he's not as he says in his own piece, he leans to the left, he votes Democratic, he does not want Donald Trump to win, and this is one of the first situations where his model is saying somebody is going to win this race that Nate Silver does not want to win. And he's pointing this out as a level of just honesty and transparency in his case to show you that this is what the model is saying. I'm not trying to change it. And this is why I've always respected Nate Silver for this. He's very honest in a lot of his prognostications. And I think a lot of his analysis of the pluses and minuses, when you're looking at just statistical analysis of where this race is going, is going to be accurate. And it's helpful because it's usually a check on some of our more partisan instincts just as humans. If you're more Republican or you're more liberal, you need those kind of checks to make you look at a race a little bit more consistently and just a little more rationally. And that's what these models are good for doing. They break you out of that partisan mold and get you to see something that wouldn't otherwise be there, I think. So the last point I want to hit here is a point that Silver makes in 2016. So he wrote a piece in 2016 called "What a Difference 2 Points Makes." And the crux of this piece is very simple. Here was the election map on election night 2016. This is where Donald Trump was winning. And you hear all sorts of things like the blue wall had failed that night. You saw all these other things that happened. But one of the things that he mentioned in this piece was the popular vote. So Clinton won the popular vote in 2016, as Joe Biden did then, but the lead there wasn't particularly helpful. And what Silver noted is that the margin that Clinton had won on, which was around 2.5 to 2.7%, is that in order to flip these states and move it back in Clinton's column, you needed to flip about 1 out of every 100 voters from Trump to Clinton. And if you did that, 1 out of every 100 voters, that shifted about 2 percentage points. And if you did that, all of a sudden Clinton's leading. And if you're looking at this map here, it should seem familiar because it's going to be very close to what Joe Biden had in 2020. You see Nevada here, you see Florida. Now, there are some interesting things here. Biden lost Florida, but took in Georgia. And so there's some differences here. But overall, the shift that Silver's describing here, I think, is right. And this is in 16. So Clinton lost and had around 2.5 to 2.7% of the popular vote. So that wasn't enough. In 2020, you have Joe Biden win around 4.5 to 4.7% of the popular vote. So that's a 2-point shift. In other words, 1 out of every 100 voters shifted in between 2016 and 2020. And that shift gave Biden enough margin that he was able to retake the lead from Trump in a lot of these narrow races. Because if you look at if you're going by the actual battleground states in 2016 and 2020, it was a very narrow race. Fewer than 100,000 voters decided that race, sprinkled across a handful of battleground states. And so when you're looking at these 2-point shifts in each direction, it kind of tells you which direction that the election is going. So with that in mind, we're going to go back here to the Real Clear Politics average and talk about this for a second. So Donald Trump is leading in the averages by 1.5 points compared to where Joe Biden was in the final average for 2020, where he was around a 4.5 point lead. You're talking a 5. Conservatively, we're talking maybe around a 4-point shift from Biden to Trump. Aggressively, if you're following these averages, you're talking close to maybe a 6-point, depending on which of the pollsters that you're following. So we're not talking right now about a shift in the electorate of just a 2-point swing between a Clinton and a Biden margin. We're talking 2 and 3 point percentage points changes, which is pretty seismic. Which means if the race has truly shifted away from Biden beyond Clinton numbers and into positive Trump territory, you're looking at blowout territory here. This kind of electoral map here, where Trump is not only leading but has a commanding lead in these things, this is not going to be a narrow map of like 270 to 268. You're talking he's going to win all the swing states involved. He very well could win all three of those Midwest states and the Sun Belt states. That's legitimately where we are right now, because the close margins where he lost in 2016, if he's improved by 2, 3, 4 percentage points in the national polls, that's going to bump him over those small margin losses from 2016. That is a very large shift. And if you have Biden hampered even more by some of these third party candidates like Kennedy, Jill Stein, and Cornel West, it's going to hurt him even more and drag down his vote totals from even beyond what he needs to be. So the reason that this is not a toss-up race is because Biden is underperforming where Clinton was in 2016, meaning that he doesn't have a 2.5-point lead in the popular vote right now. He's currently losing that vote. We very well, I mean, if these polls end up holding, it would not be shocking if you saw Donald Trump not only win the race, but win the popular vote. That's where we are right now. And that's not a toss-up race because Donald Trump is one of the weaker candidates we've had in a while on either side. Clinton was up there too, and he's holding a commanding lead over Joe Biden. And this is a rematch, so they both have a term in the White House, and they're both running on a record here. So a true incumbency advantage doesn't really go to Biden in this race. This is not a challenger versus an incumbent. Donald Trump is running on his first term in office. Joe Biden is running on his first term in office, and voters are comparing these two things to each other. And if you haven't liked the last 4 years, you're going to ask yourself not whether a challenger would make things different for your life, but whether or not Trump's 4 years in office were better versus Biden's. And if you're comparing on something like inflation, well, that's a pretty easy comparison. You're going to reject that outright. So this is where we are. You have the models, The Economist is currently giving around a 70% chance for Trump winning. Nate Silver is at 66%. You have the new 538, which is around, Trump is favored to win, but it's a coin flip for them, which kind of tells you how much that model has shifted. And so just in every metric that we're looking at right now, if you're just looking at the polls, you're looking at the fundamentals of the race, if you're looking at the swing states, no matter what data point that you choose right now, it's showing the same thing. It's showing that Donald Trump is winning. And that is the real storyline heading into this first debate. Joe Biden has to find a way to shake up this race. If he comes out of this first debate and he has not shaken up the debate and the race fundamentals so much that Donald Trump plunges in the polls, then this debate's going to be a loss for him. It can't be like a State of the Union or even this conviction storyline where there's a splash for about a week or two and maybe you see a bump 1 to 2 points maybe in Biden's direction. Biden needs the numbers to shift from Trump plus 1.5 to Biden plus 4 plus 5. Biden has to recreate his 2020 electorate. He has to recreate the voting bloc that got him into office, that got Obama into office in 2012. And right now, it's the exact opposite. Right now, you're looking at, as Nate Silver put it, a reverse 2012, where Biden is kind of close on the national level. Admittedly, 1.5 points, that's a close thing. But if you just shifted that 2 points and, if you gave it Biden plus 1.5, that would not be the margin that he would need in order to win this race. Biden needs to win the popular vote by 4 to 5 points, and he needs to have evidence that that's happening in the polls as well. And right now, he's underperforming there. He's underperforming, in the states, and the spending that you're seeing from the White House sort of suggests that they understand this as well. And, with the New York Times putting out stories, and I've written about these in my columns, you have the New York Times writing about stories where a lot of Democratic activists are already moving on to, well, how do we stop Trump? It's sort of the hashtag resistance 2.0. These people are already starting to pivot into, well, Donald Trump's going to win, so what do we do to stop him for the next 4 years? That's a telling sign. It's telling you where the money is headed, and it tells you where the activists are headed. And when you see something like what happened in New York, where Jamal Bowman is going down, it's another sign for the progressive left that they're on the menu too, where Biden is performing so poorly that the progressive left, cannot even win their own primaries right now. So it's a troubling time if you're a Democrat. This is Um, Again, I know going into the CNN debate, they're going to call it a close race because they've got, 1 to 2 points in national polling sounds like a close race. In reality, this is not a very close race right now, and it's disingenuous to call it a toss up. This is a Donald Trump's race right now, and it's his race to lose. Can he lose? Absolutely. We still got a lot of time to go. But what we've seen in 2016 and 2020 is that as he got closer and closer to those November elections, the polls shifted a bit harder towards Trump. Donald Trump overperformed his polls in 2016 and 2020. Biden has not overperformed his polls. So at some point, if you're going to say that Biden's going to win, you have to make the case that he's going to overperform his polls, something he has not done. Obama did it in 2008 and 2012, but Joe Biden has not. Can he do it? Well, if he does, it will be the first time we've ever seen him do that. So that's what to keep in mind as we head into the debates on Thursday. I will have a reaction to the debates either up on Thursday or sometime on Friday. That's my plan right now to get that up. And we'll go through some of the early exit pollings of the debates, any surprise moments that may have come up. And, you're free to sound off in the comments too. If you've had any reactions of things that have happened, make sure to go ahead and put that in the comments of things that you're noticing from that. So that's all I've got for tonight. I will see you guys after the debates are over, and we'll look through all of that together.